a great program lined up for you tonight. Eric Lovely is joining me. He's on Skype with me right now. But holding on the line, we have Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. He's going to be a guest for the first half hour. He can only make it for the first half hour, so I'm not going to do a big warm-up here or a big opening monologue because I want to pick the brain of the great Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. But I will say this in setting a stage for what I want to talk to Dr. Roberts about. Here we sit, the euphoria of the G8 summit has now left the building. We had a rally yesterday. They tried to rally today, and we ended up falling back below par on the day. Now, this, along with news coming out that, I've had some of you, thanks for sending me all this information, sending me information about Greece exiting the Eurozone over this long 3-day holiday weekend. Regardless if it happens over this long holiday 3-day weekend, or if we see it happen a month or a year down the road, the facts are real simple. The too big to fail institutions that brought the world to the brink of disaster, as we sit here and teeter on the brink of disaster, with which was once private failure, which has been turned into public failure. As the world sits here on a sovereign debt landmine that's about to explode, we still see the same institutions such as J.P. Morgan Chase continuing to practice the same gambits that led to where we are right here and right now. That's it I want to do for the warm-up because Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, excuse me for butchering your name, Dr. Roberts, not only was he one of the editors at the Wall Street Journal, he was also Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, author, and the list goes on and on. In fact, if I read all this off, I wouldn't be able to interview him. So let's bring him onto the program. Dr. Roberts, thank you very much for coming on to Wide Awake News Radio.
You're welcome.
It's great to have you. I usually do a little bit longer opening monologue, but, I want to get right down to the nitty-gritty with you. We've been playing this game of kicking the can down the road when it comes to Europe over the last 3.5-4 years, namely Greece. But it isn't just Greece. We're replacing leaders. We're putting in technocrats in Greece and Italy. And now we see the people of Europe starting to stand up and say, enough of this, in never-ending bailouts to these banks, making sure they're never going to fail by issuing austerity onto us, the people of Europe. Are we heading for a sovereign debt implosion out of Europe that will necessitate a financial collapse here in the U.S.? And I know your answer is probably going to be yes to that, but I guess the question would be, do you see it on the near-term horizon, or are we just continuing to kick the can down the road for another generation?
Well, I think I see it a bit differently.
Okay.
The situation in the United States is worse because the financial system was deregulated and remains deregulated. And the consequence of that is that there's no limits on the debt leverage of the banks. There's no limits on them gambling with depositors' money. And there's nothing that has altered the casino or gambling nature of the American financial system, which in my view no longer performs any useful social function. So the situation in the United States is far worse. Now, the guys in Washington can use Wall Street and the financial press to keep all the focus on Europe. And by doing that, they keep the realization of their own woes. Now, the case in Europe is probably overblown, largely because it serves Washington's interests. It keeps the pressure off the dollar and puts it on the euro. Normally, when commercial banks have creditors who can't pay, they restructure the debts. They write them down to the amount that can be paid. Now, in Europe, this hasn't occurred. As you observed, the way they have proceeded is to try to keep the banks from losing any money by forcing the of the bank's mistakes onto the people of the indebted countries, claiming that those people benefited from the loans and therefore they should tighten the belt to service them. Whether or not Greece exits the euro really depends on Germany. Germany will make that decision. They'll decide whether they want to keep Europe together in the euro and preside over it as a form of empire and pay the costs for that, or whether they want to cut their losses and boot Greece out. Now, that decision hasn't been made. I doubt Greece itself will make the decision, certainly not before the next election. And that's in June, I believe. So the Germans know that if they boot Greece, they may also end up booting a number of other countries.
Right.
Spain, Italy, Portugal. And I don't think the Germans have decided whether they want to pay the cost of having an economic empire and a single currency, or whether they want to bust it all up. So if it busts up, I think it'll go beyond Greece. It'll have been a German decision that doesn't really serve their interest. And they haven't made that decision. So I don't know the outcome, but I think the situation is more desperate in the United States because here there's no real discussion of the real problems. And,
right.
And the dollar is the world reserve currency. And that's the source of Washington's power. And if the dollar loses that role, then the United States as a great power is finished, but so is the international financial system.
But don't we already see, don't we see countries, China, Russia, Brazil, these BRIC nations, we see India, we see Russia and China talking about trading energy in their own currency. Isn't there already a move that maybe certainly isn't being reported by our mainstream propagandists, but isn't there a move afoot on this planet to get away from this ticking time bomb that is the U.S. dollar?
Well, just recently, the presidents of four of the BRIC countries and the Prime Minister of India, making the fifth, did meet, and the coverage of it isn't, as you say, it's not very extensive, but it does appear that they discussed forming a bank that would allow the five countries to conduct the trade with one another with their own currencies, and that this new BRIC bank would simply cease to use dollars. So dollars would no longer be part of the commerce between the BRICS, as you said, Russia, the two Asian giants, India and China, and the largest economy in Africa, which is South Africa, and in South America, which is Brazil. So they would simply start up dealing with one another through their individual currencies. So the dollar would cease to be, for them, the method of international payment. And yes, so that's happening. And they can see the trouble with the debt and money creation in the United States. And they see how Europe is really, or NATO, and the NATO countries are essentially American puppet states. And if they don't get pulled down by their own mistakes, get pulled down by Washington's. So there is that movement out of the dollar-based international financial system.
Right. Do you see, and I think that, especially in alternative media, that has been widely reported, especially since the 2008-2009 time period where countries are quietly trying to figure out other plans besides the U.S. dollar. Do you see this crisis, in this dollar crisis, coming to a head, as you said, and as I've read in some of your recent articles, because we have a deregulated financial system that is basically just cannibalizing itself? It's not investing in business, investing in growth. It is more akin to being in Vegas or Atlantic City. They're just gambling away, and at some point, this is all going to come to a fiery end. But do you see the world being, I mean, if we look at a bigger, broader overview of it, do we see the world taking sides to where, we've seen throughout history before that, that sometimes financial crises lead to hot wars? I mean, is the world being positioned in order for the final resolution of all this debt, which will be a convenient distraction of a global war?
I don't think the debt implies war. That's implied by the neoconservative Washington push for world hegemony. The debt can destroy the dollar as reserve currency and leave the rest of the world without a reserve currency, other than these countries that are already trying to prepare for the future, the BRICS. Mm-hmm. I think that the BRICS will be careful about it because, some of them hold massive amounts of dollar-denominated assets, and they probably don't want to lose them. China is our biggest creditor, and I think they've got something like total dollar-denominated holdings of about $2 trillion, and so they don't really want that to flush. India will have some because of their trade surplus. Russia will have them because of its energy. It sells energy to Europe. Mm-hmm. Brazil and South Africa are doing reasonably well, and I don't really know what the state of their trade surpluses are, but they've probably got dollar holdings. So nobody really wants to lose those values. They would like this to last long enough that they can get out of most of that and convert it into something else.
Right, sell their debt.
But they can't be too quick about it or too obvious, or it sets off the crisis. If China were to announce that they were getting rid of all their treasury bonds and give any kind of a timetable, then that itself would probably provoke the end of the dollar. But they have to do it piecemeal, and the whole time they continue to accumulate dollars because they continue to run trade surpluses with the United States. So the fact that they can't just dump that many dollar-denominated assets or all their treasury bond holdings in a short period of time without precipitating the crisis and destroying the value of their own assets, dollar assets, means that all this may take longer than you would think. From the severity of the problems, it may take longer to get rid of the dollar as a reserve currency, simply because so many people have a stake in it.
All right. Well, let me ask you this, because we have you for about 5 more minutes, is all, Dr. Roberts. Since 2008, we went from roughly $8 trillion in debt to tapping on the door of the next debt ceiling increase at just over $16 trillion in debt. We've seen the global sovereign debt mushroom to this nearly 50% increase in a little over 4 years. And we've seen the institutions that have led to all this acquisition of debt by nations trying to rescue economies and rescue these too big to fail institutions. We've not only seen that not change with regulation, with Dodd-Frank and other regulation that seems to have no teeth. It's gotten much, much worse. So, we talk about nations that are holding a lot of U.S. debt, and they have a vested interest in not letting this go into a crisis. In your opinion, your professional opinion, how much longer can this accumulation of failure, how much longer can this accumulation of burdensome debt continue before we implode under our own weight?
Well, I think we have a way to go. We can continue to issue debt for a while. You know, the main driver of the debt is the wars. I mean, these are $1 trillion annual deficits, and this is the wars and the military security part of the budget, and the economy, of course, has been dead in the water for really the entirety of this new century because of jobs offshoring. All the jobs are gone, so there's no growth in income, and everybody's loaded up with debt, so they can't really stimulate the economy with more debt because the consumers are already drowning in it, and the government's debt is really about half of what it is in Japan. Of course, they owe it all to themselves, and we don't, but I think what's going to cause the crisis here won't be the government's debt so much as it will be the untenable position of the financial system, these 5 huge banks that are too big to fail and that are on the hook with trillions of dollars of derivatives that nobody knows what they're worth or how that is going to come undone. You understand the Federal Reserve has already created in loans $16.1 trillion, which is larger than the national debt for those banks. So it's the money the Fed is creating to keep the banks afloat.